Rule of St. Benedict, a Commentary, by Paul Delatte, Chapter 39, of the Measure of Food. Quote from St. Benedict's Rule. We think it sufficient for the daily meal, whether at the 6th or the 9th hour, that there be at all the tables 2 dishes of cooked food, because of the variety of men's weaknesses, so that he who may not be able to eat of the one may make his meal of the other. Therefore let 2 cooked dishes suffice for the brethren. And if there be any fruit or young vegetables, let a 3rd dish be added. Unquote. Commentary. If the fathers of the desert could have read this chapter of the rule, they would perhaps have regarded its provisions as lax. Some of their masters certainly recommended discretion in abstinence and fasting, quite in St. Benedict's fashion. But the most generous measure of an Eastern monk is less than the fare which our Holy Father allows daily to his disciples, comprising as this does 3 courses. And yet St. Benedict only puts this regime forward with reserve, as a reasonable mean allowance, leaving the abbot power to add to it. Such considerateness is easily justified if we recognize the entirely relative value of mortification, and remember the end at which our Holy Father was aiming. He wished to make the monastic life accessible to souls that might be deterred by extreme austerity. He wished to adapt his rule to Western constitutions and to a more rigorous climate, which compels men to compensate for the lack of external warmth by the use of more potent bodily fuel. We must add that he wrote for men who not only performed long liturgical duties, but also labored in the open air for part of the day. The fare which he gives his monks is practically peasant's fare, simple and plentiful. At all the tables, that is to say at those occupied by the monks in small groups, under the presidency of the deans, or else at the community tables, the servers' table, and the abbot's, at all the tables 2 cooked dishes shall be served. St. Benedict does not think it suitable or even possible to be precise as to their nature. Usage has varied enormously in this matter, nor need we attempt to summarize it. Vegetables have always formed the basis of monastic fare. Eggs, fish, and milk products appeared more rarely at the table in former days. At Cluny they served cooked beans every day, and this was the staple dish par excellence. St. Benedict naturally does not order the eating of the 2 dishes. He allows them so that all appetites may be satisfied, and that all may recruit their strength. He adds that, thanks to the 2 courses, a brother who cannot eat of one will be able to make his meal on the other. But have we the right, according to the rule, to patronize both? Commentators are agreed among themselves, and with custom, in answering in the affirmative. So let 2 cooked dishes suffice for the brethren, continues St. Benedict, and let a 3rd be added of fruit or fresh vegetables, if they can be procured easily, that is to say, if they are in the monastery garden. The menu of our Holy Father has just given is that of the whole day. The quantity of food supplied each day, or the daily fare, whether there were 2 meals or only 1, both in Lent and during the rest of the year. At least this is the best founded interpretation of the very concise phrase of the rule, for the daily meal, whether at the 6th or the 9th hour. St. Benedict only speaks of the meal at the 6th or the 9th hour, When dinner was at the 6th hour, there was supper in the evening. But the meal at the 6th hour was the chief one, and probably furnished supper not only with that third part of bread of which St. Benedict speaks presently, but also with such articles of food as were better suited to a frugal supper. On the fast days appointed by the rule, dinner was at the 9th hour. During the ecclesiastical Lent, the sole meal was taken in the evening, but the quantity of food was always the same, St. Benedict leaving it to the discretion of each individual to make such retrenchment as was compatible with health and obedience. Most ancient monastic customaries confirm these comments. A quote from the rule: "Let a pound weight of bread suffice for each day, whether there be but one meal or both dinner and supper. If they are to sup, let a third part of the pound be kept back by the cellarer and given to them for supper." Unquote. The commentary: Every day, whether there be but one meal or both dinner and supper, a pound of bread shall suffice. A generous pound of full weight, turning the scale definitely. If there be supper, the cellarer shall reserve the third part of this pound. Markings made in the baking probably facilitated this partition. Endless discussions have arisen as to the exact quantity of the pound weight, just as with the hemina of wine spoken of in the next chapter. All these researches have their interest for curiosity and erudition, but they have none whatever as true commentary and elucidation of the rule. Even if we suppose that measures, while keeping the same names, have not varied with time and country, it is clear in the case before us that our Holy Father employs the customary measures in an approximate and not in an exact way. His pound of bread is something over a pound. The capacity of his hemina is perhaps calculated in a way that would satisfy the requirements of weaker brethren. But what is still more decisive is the care which the monks of Monte Cassino took to preserve the weight of bread and measures of wine fixed by our Holy Father. They carried them to Rome in A.D. 581, when they were driven out by the Lombards. Perhaps Petronax and the restorers of Monte Cassino recovered them, thanks to Pope Zachary, A.D. 741 to 752. Finally, Theodomar, abbot of Monte Cassino, sent to Charlemagne the measures of bread and wine as determined by St. Benedict. All these precautions were superfluous if the pound and the hemina were invariable measures known to all and in current use. And it is quite clear that they were not preserved as memorials of our Father, but as special standards appointed by him. The Roman pound was equivalent, according to recent calculations, to 327.45 grams, 11.5 ounces avoirdupois approximate. This would be a small amount as a daily ration of men working in the fields. Calmet says there is reason to believe that St. Benedict did not take the Roman pound containing 12 ounces, Roman, but the pound of commerce containing 16. Many commentators find even this too small. Our constitutions wisely declare that, since the value of St. Benedict's pound is unknown, bread shall be given without restriction. Quote from St. Benedict: "If, however, their work have been greater, it shall be at the will and in the power of the abbot, if it be expedient, to make some addition, provided that excess be before all things avoided, that no monk suffer from surfeiting. For nothing is more contrary to any Christian life than excess, as our Lord says, quote, 'Take heed to yourselves, lest perhaps your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness.' And let not the same quantity be allotted to children of tender years, but less to the elders, frugality being observed in all things." Unquote. However large already the ordinary daily allowance of food and drink, St. Benedict still leaves the abbot the power to add to it, if he think fit, as for the example in the case of extraordinary toil. So he does not purpose to drive all his monks by rule to heroic mortification and extreme severity towards the flesh. The abbot's function is not to crush his monks, but to establish a just ratio between their work and the physical recruitment which it requires. Only he must beware of excess. Above all things, his adjustments must never favor gluttony, and a monk must never be surprised by the shameful consequences of excess. For nothing is so degrading, not alone for a monk, but for any Christian, as such excess. Our Lord was addressing all his followers when he said, quote, "Take heed to yourselves, lest perhaps your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness." Unquote. Luke 21:34. St. Benedict adds that the children in the monastery shall have a quantity suitable to their age, and along with the considerate treatment that they merit, there will also be in all things such austerity as is agreeable to the life which they have already professed. In our days, perhaps, the tendency to excess will display itself rather in fastidiousness and singularity than in gluttony properly so called. And strangely enough, it is actually necessary sometimes to persuade people to eat, just as though they were Manichaeans and eating was sinful. We sometimes meet with wrong-headed folk who regard eating and drinking as a humiliating function, and do themselves great injury by their monomia. Such as these need watching and even constraint. But apart from these pathological cases, the abbot leaves each individual free to decide in God's sight what he should take and what deny himself. We eat to live. We take what is needful to sustain us in our work and fit us to face our duty. And always must we observe that rule of good breeding, health, and mortification, which bids us stop before satiety. Nor should the refectory and its business become the preoccupation of our lives, a constant and harassing anxiety. The idea of compensations and additions to the ordinary fare has generally been well understood and realized under various forms. The customaries and cartularies of the Middle Ages often mention extra courses and the distribution of pittances. At Cluny, in the end, they regularly added to their beans and other vegetables a general, or pittance, of eggs, fish, and cheese. By general was meant a portion served to each monk on a special plate. The pittance was a dish for two. Modern stomachs cannot manage the solid meals of our ancestors. It is true that they submitted to bloodletting, often a monthly occurrence, but to compensate at once for the lowering treatment, the patient was given a substantial general, and sometimes to a thorough regime of feeding up. Quote from the rule, "But let all abstain from eating the flesh of four-footed animals, except the very weak and the sick." Unquote. We may remind ourselves of what St. Benedict said in reference to the sick in the 36th chapter. Quote, "The use of meat too shall be permitted to the sick," unquote, etc. In this place also we have the same prohibition for the healthy and the same exception for the seriously ill or weak. But St. Benedict here makes the scope of his prohibition more precise by the words carnium vera quadrupedum, thus forbidding the flesh of four-footed animals. Does this phrase exclude other sorts of flesh, so that fowls would be permitted? However strange it may appear to us, it would seem to be incontestable that, in St. Benedict's time and for centuries afterwards, birds were considered by many, we do not say by all, as fare compatible with abstinence. You could deny yourself such flesh meat for mortification, but it was recognized to be flesh of an inferior quality, though it might be more delicate and more agreeable to the taste than the flesh of quadrupeds. It was less nourishing and less apt to stimulate the passions. And did not Genesis say that the birds and fishes were created on the same day, and both alike taken from the waters? Why not treat waterfowl as fish, for they live on them and taste like them? Whatever be the value of the reasons formerly alleged in justification of the practice of treating bipeds as abstinence fare, it was a custom, and everyone knows that moral theologians still in our own days allow a certain waterfowl on abstinence days. They would, however, surprise us on a monastic table, and for us the question has been practically decided.